Good morning to all my friends joining us from South Asia and East Asia, and good evening to those of us in North America. I'm Hari Narayan, and we are gathered here to discuss a forgotten chapter of India's post independence history, one that concerns Chinese Indians. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that I'm joining you from UBC, which is located on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. I first welcome our guests, Joy Ma, Dilip D'Souza, Kwayon Lee, and Sering Shakya. I also wish to thank Eve Tibergian, co-director of the Center for Japanese Research, M.V. Ramana, acting director of the Center for India and South Asia Research, and Tim Cheek, director of the Institute of Asian Research, for planning the event. A few logistical announcements before we get started. The two authors can take up to 15 minutes each to speak on the issue. This would be followed by a 10-minute talk each by Kwai and Professor Shakya. Finally, we have about 30 minutes of Q&A. The chat function has been disabled, so please ask your questions using the Q&A window. The webinar, including the Q&A session, would be recorded. We will be making the recording available on the SPPGA YouTube channel. And finally, you are not required to use your camera or microphone to participate in the Q&A session. I now pass on the mic to Professor Cheek to set the tone for the event.
Thank you very much, Hari. And I'm Timothy Cheek. I'm the director of the Institute of Asian Research and also a professor at the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs. And I'm here to welcome you all on behalf of the Institute of Asian Research, which is in the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs. We value research and engagement on public policy issues in and with Asia. The Institute of Asian Research itself has 5 constituent area centers. This evening, in fact, it's the Center for India and South Asian Research, represented by my colleague Ramana, that is sponsoring this event, co-sponsoring this event. But this topic crosses national boundaries, Chinese, Indian, and Canadian, all the way to Toronto. And it's these connections that we care about at the Institute and at the Policy School, and that we research and, when it's possible, celebrate. So tonight I welcome you for this wonderful program, and I look forward to enjoying and learning with you. And I turn it over now to Ramana, I think. No, I don't.
That's okay. I will just extend a word of welcome to you all on behalf of the Center for India and South Asia Research, and I will pass it on to Eve.
So good morning to friends in Asia, and good evening for all of you in Canada. Great joy to join you with this event. And I just wanted to add a little personal touch of how this event came together. We're here really celebrating this book, which came out last year, written by Joy and Dilip, who are here with us. And the amazing part is I've known Joy since 1995. I was a classmate with her husband, Bill, at Stanford, and we, several times I visited their home and we had all kind of discussions. At the time, I had no idea about this history, about the Deoliwallahs and the camp, because as it turned out, this was something that people didn't talk about. And it's only in recent years that Joy decided to join others and tell her story and write this beautiful, moving book. It's also tribute to her mother, and Joy will say a few more things about that. So I want to really thank Joy for this journey, which is difficult to come out and tell stories like this. And also, here we're celebrating an old friendship, and I've learned immensely through this book, and I think we'll all learn tonight. Also wonderful to have so many scholars with many perspectives here joining together, and Dilip joining us from India. So amazing event, I think. Thank you.
Thank you, Eve. Oh, sorry. Was I supposed to go?
Thank you.
I would like to first introduce Joy before you begin speaking, because we would like the audience to have a brief idea of your association with the event. So Joy is our first speaker today and one of the co-authors of Deoliwallahs. She is one of the few children born in the internment camp and spent her first 4 years in the camp. She completed her education in India before moving to the US, where she currently lives. We now invite Joy to share her reflections on what it means to be a Chinese Indian and to be shunned by the country of your birth and to have to stay silent about this experience. Joy, now the floor is yours.
Thank you, Hari. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. It's an honor to be with these wonderful panelists, and especially my co-author Dilip, who's been amazing and great writer and very supportive. I want to dedicate today's talk in memory of my mother. She just passed in the end of March, and she was my inspiration for writing this book. So by now, you know, my name is Joy Ma, and I was one of the babies who was born in the camp. The very fact that you are all joining us means that you know something about the internment. Some of you know it well. Some of you know it a little, you know, just in passing, and then there are others who might not know a lot about it. But I would venture that if you were to speak to your friends, 90% or more would not know about the internment of 3,000 plus Chinese Indians in India in 1962. So I know the topic is about citizenship and what it means to belong. And there are three things I want to cover in my talk. Why I wrote the book, briefly what happened and what happened after the camp, and then what our goals are for the book and the importance of it. I wrote this book to bring awareness to the event. It's an event that's not known. For years and years, people who were interned in the camp spoke amongst themselves, you know, as far as support went. But we wouldn't share it with our colleagues, our friends from other communities, or even the students that we studied with. It was not a delightful experience. It was an experience that brought shame and stigma. And for that reason, people were just not willing to talk about it. And a lot of people preferred to forget about it until we met our own community. It's important to bring awareness to the event and inform people about what happened. Excuse me. We cannot begin to redress a wrong when we don't know anything about it. I wrote it to memorialize the experience of the people who were interned. Who were these people? These people are adults. They were teenagers. They were children. Excuse me. And I want you to think for a moment to imagine your own children, your own parents, and your siblings being in a camp, an internment camp. Excuse me. I want to talk briefly about what happened at the camp. When you read the book, you will find from me the stories of 7 people, and then my mother and our family. And we talk about what people did on a daily basis, how they went to the camp, and then what happened after the camp. A lot of the people I interviewed and got to know their accounts were children. They were more concerned about, you know, how to pass their days, what to do, and how they wanted to get out of the camp. If I have some time, I'll read you a chapter, a little section from my brother. He would like to share with you how he felt as a child. I've been told that some of these chapters are a little bit monotonous. I think it's by design. There was not a lot to do in the camp. Children did not go to school. They did not have any activities. Once a week, there was a film, a movie played, and you'll hear from my brother's account how music was played on a daily basis, some sad and distressing music. For a lot of people, what happened in the camp was terrible. What was worse was what happened after. Why was that? There were two main places where the people were interned from. It was Northwest Bengal, that is Darjeeling, Kalimpong, Kurseong, all those areas. And then Eastern India, from Shillong, from the states of Assam and what was to become Meghalaya. These towns included Shillong, Markham, and Tinsukia. Northwest Bengal was deemed a sensitive area, and the people who came from there could not go back. They were sent to Calcutta, where they were sent without resources and expected to build their own lives and survive. In Assam, some experiences were very bad, such as the experience of Yingsheng Wong, and then also he had to experience buying his own machinery back from the state and to pay taxes for the years in Deoli. I bring up Yingsheng Wong because one of the things he talks about is how he felt really not a part of the country. He was born in India, he lived all his life in India, and he ultimately chose to immigrate to Canada. And when he arrived in Canada, he felt such a relief that he had never experienced in his life. The other person I want to talk about briefly is Eva Cheng. So Eva never went to the camp. Her father was 6 years old when he was taken to the camp, and he grew up. He had a family, and he had, among his children was Eva. But Eva always felt a darkness whenever he talked about the camp. And I think I have a little time that I can read a chapter from Eva's book, from Eva's chapter. It's really important. She's a millennial, and it shows how events of trauma affect our future generations. So she talks about the movement, and what does she mean by the movement? She means that the more organized fashion of how we're talking about our experience and bringing knowledge to the world about what my family went through, what other families went through, what the whole community of 3,000 Indian Chinese went through. So she says, the most profound way that this movement has made me feel, especially now that I'm an adult and around the age my parents were when they moved here, is that I wonder if there ever will be a country that is home. And if yes, what would it mean to have a country that I can call home? As part of it is being an overseas Chinese. Being Hakka, it is very common to migrate and to keep moving. But the camp has really affected me in how I trust a government, trust a country, trust its people. I've realized that something that's always set me apart from my siblings and some of my friends is just how critical I can be about a system of governance and its leaders. People always poke fun at me and say, you're so judgmental about this. I say, I guess when I've seen and heard what my parents have gone through, how much love and trust they put in a place, into the community that they were in, only to see their hearts get broken over and over again. These memories and stories will always be stuck with me. If I had to find a word about how the camp experience makes me feel, it would perhaps be alienated, or maybe just brokenhearted. I've grown up feeling a similar sense of alienation here in the US, and I've drawn a lot of parallels between what my dad experienced and what I'm experiencing. It leaves me with a big question mark. I'm just not sure what it even feels like to be happy and secure in a place. Yiva's words really set the tone for how many people who were interned in Deoli felt after they were released. They did not have a good time after the internment. And as I mentioned, a lot of people migrated to Canada. There's a community in Toronto, a very big community, and there's a community in Vancouver. There's fewer people in the United States. When we talk about India, we still, we speak in Hindi, people sing songs in Hindi. Dilip might talk a little bit about that. And I want to talk a little bit about why it was so difficult for the people who were incarcerated in Deoli. So uh, I was a citizen of India by virtue of being born after 1955. India's Citizenship Act granted me that path. But for many people who were born before independence, there was no path for gaining citizenship. These were people who, the Chinese families who had been in India for several generations. For example, my parents were born in India, and I'm second generation born in India. But for the folks who were born before independence, when they tried to seek this their citizenship, they were told to go to the British government and get citizenship of the United Kingdom. And then when they went to the UK officials, they said, well, you're born in India. You're not going to go to the United Kingdom. You should find citizenship in the place you live. So there was no clear path. It was very difficult. And eventually, a lot of people were stateless or they chose Chinese passports. In summation, how am I doing on time, Hari? Like a few more minutes?
We have time, Joy. We have around
Okay.
5 more minutes.
Okay, 5 more minutes. Okay, great. So I'm just going to sum up before I read my brother's note to the group. I think you'll find it very heartbreaking and interesting. So I want to acknowledge my mom's contribution to this book. Her vivid memory and unflinching view of how wrong the internment was made her one of the most outspoken people in her own quiet way of the internees and for the internees. I mean, she was never a public figure, but she had her opinion and she would let you know. Mom really believed in living in the moment, which is why it was doubly painful for her to suspend living for all those long years in Deoli. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and read you what my brother wrote. When I read it, it was eye-opening. So my brother titled this little note, "The Deoliwallahs as seen from the eyes of a small boy." I was only 8 years old when we were incarcerated in 1963 at a remote POW World War II camp in the desert town of Deoli by the Indian government. As Chinese Indians, we were unfortunately perceived enemies as a result of the India-China border war in 1962. The arrest and journey from my hometown of Hashimara, a small town in the West Bengal province, was harrowing due to the terrible condition of the jail, where we civilians who had nothing to do with the war were put together with murderers and convicts. My late beloved mother, Effa, who passed away, was one of the few senior survivors of this horrendous incarceration. She used to tell me that I was crying most of the time, not understanding what was happening as I was separated from my cousins and enduring a harsh condition. On the day of this arrest, the last memory of my grandfather and grandmother were through teary eyes, looking at the whole family who were assembled in front of the family home. They were all crying as police took us away on Chinese New Year's Day in 1963. It was January 25th. I never saw my grandfather again as he died of a broken heart. I have painful recollections of the experience of loss of freedom, the stolen childhood, of seeing my parents and siblings suffer in silence, and they have left an indelible scar on me. The stultifying, scorching summer heat of Deoli in Rajasthan, the terrible sandstorms, and the high barbed wire fencing that kept me out of the free outside world. In the summer, it was difficult to breathe, and every pore of the body would sweat profusely. The heat was incredibly intense, even on the clothes. Even the clothes worn felt like scalding patches. There was no air conditioning, leave alone fans. The sense of desolation and despair as every family was released in batches and we were the last few dozen families left behind was lasting. The feeling of hopelessness of not knowing when our family would be released. The dread of a small boy who thought his family would be left forgotten in this hellish detention camp and be wiped out, forgotten by humanity. This was all the more amplified as I saw many summers and winters come and go. I felt the loss of freedom every winter when I watched the green bee eaters whose shrill cries heralded winter and the glimpse of hope brought on vanished quickly as they would fly away when it got warmer. The birds were free to come and go, but we were imprisoned with our liberty taken away from us. My late brother Lyndon and I were deprived education for 5 years. It was a basic human right that no child should be bereft of. The camp authorities did not provide any schooling or educational material, and thanks to my father Jack, who taught us English using an Oxford English dictionary and math, he gave us a rudimentary foundation at a very difficult time. Every evening over the PA system, a scratchy tape recording of the haunting and melancholy song from the film Bis Sal Baad, which meant 20 years later, was played. It was a torture of the worst kind. The song was played in a loop and often lasted an hour to ensure we understood that we were the forgotten ones and no one would care whether we lived or died. It was one of the most frightening reminders of hopelessness and helplessness we were faced with. I give thanks to my sister Joy, who had to relive all these heartrending stories recounted in her book with Philip. It is fitting that India, the world's largest democracy, with an enlightened attitude, has a responsibility to acknowledge the injustice that was done to the Indian Chinese community and offer an apology to reaffirm its place in the global stage.
Thank you, Joy, for the
Thank you
moving
for listening.
portrait. Yeah.
Thank you, Hari.
Yeah, it was a really moving portrait, and to hear what your brother had written, and uh, I should say that lot of the themes in your book resonate with a lot of people who are coming from a similar background and who have not been able to speak out so far. So you have been a voice of the community. So we now pass on the mic to Dilip D'Souza, co-author of the book Deoliwallahs. Engineer turned writer Dilip has won multiple awards for his journalism, including the Daily Beast Award for Nonfiction and the Outlook Picador Prize. Apart from Deoliwallahs, Dilip has authored 6 books, including one on India's denotified tribes. I pass on the mic to Dilip.
Thank you, Hari. I trust you can all hear me. Just give me a thumbs up. Okay. Thank you, Hari. Thank you, Eves, and thank you all of you at the University of British Columbia for organizing this. Joy and I are really feel privileged to have this chance. Of course, we want our book to be read as widely as possible, and all that is there. But this has been this whole pandemic year has been hard on any kind of what's the word? Getting word about the book out. So we are grateful that you've taken an interest and that people are listening to us and that you've given us this opportunity. I want to start, if I can, Hari, I can share my screen, right? Is that?
Sure, Dilip, you can.
I just want to show a couple of pictures to acknowledge somebody who, in a sense, has been an inspiration to me, and you will recognize immediately. And I just want you to see her face. So this is the person. I'm going to share the screen now. Here we go. Okay, can you see that? That's Joy's mother, whom she just spoke about. Her name is Effa, and this is her face as I first saw her in Rafiq Elias's film Beyond Barbed Wire. And I want to show you now. How can I get out of this now? Stop share. And I want to show you now this is how I saw her later on the cover of our book. There's Joy and there's Effa in the middle, and the family as it was when they went to Deoli. And Joy, Effa is presumably pregnant at this moment when this picture was taken, or shortly after, with Joy. And William, whom you heard about, is on the left of the picture, to Effa's right. So this is the lady who sadly we lost about 2.5 3 weeks ago, if I'm not mistaken, and I'd only seen her in these pictures and heard of her and read her account in Joy's book as we put it together, and but I feel privileged that a year ago I actually went to California and I met Effa briefly at Joy's house. So in many ways, for Joy, she was the inspiration for this book, but I want to tell you, Joy, also that she was for me too. Okay, that's my little share screen. If I can now stop the share. So with that said, we're talking today about Deoliwallahs, the book, but we're also talking deliberately, I think, about questions of citizenship. And we're talking about, when we talk about questions of citizenship, there are reasons for that. Why are we talking today about questions of citizenship? What does that mean? So I'm just going to give you some thoughts that I've had about that, about citizenship and its relevance to this issue, to this book, and maybe more broadly. So why is it that we're talking about questions of citizenship? Because in 1942 and in 1962 in particular, these were the kinds of questions that got asked, that they were raised by different mass incarcerations. As you know, the Japanese Americans during World War II in 1942, also in Canada, of course, and in 1962 it was our own Indians, India's own Chinese Indians, because of our war with China. Those incarcerations raised these questions of citizenship. So the most fundamental question, of course, then you might think is, who is a citizen? And yet, sadly, that's not quite the question that got asked and answered then. That's because actually it's a relatively difficult question to answer if you really think about it. So the easier question got asked, which is, who is not a citizen? And in these two incarcerations, the simple answer came very easily. It was people who looked Japanese American in 1942, and it was people who looked like Chinese in 1962. I mean, people who looked Japanese in 1942 and people who looked Chinese in 1962. Though, of course, in some sense, it wasn't even that specific a question that got asked, who is not a Chinese, who is not a citizen? Because in ways that were entirely legal, many of those people who were incarcerated in both these times were actually citizens anyway. So asking that question would not give you the right answer for incarcerating them. So in the end, the real question that got asked, and that whose answers were allowed, the answers allowed 3,000 Chinese Indians to go to prison, was, whom can we treat as if they have no rights like other citizens of our country? That's the question, really, if you think about it, that got asked. And the answer in India was 3,000 Chinese Indians. So I really feel it's important to tease out these strands, if you like, of citizenship. Because in India, we felt it was important and necessary at that time to cloak this prejudice that people were starting to feel against China, against Chinese-looking people, because of our war with China. We wanted to cloak that in some kind of legal framework. Because, in 1962, we were only 15 years young as a country. And so I don't think that India really wanted to be seen as a banana republic that was willing to imprison people on flimsy grounds, even though they were flimsy in the end. But we wanted to show that we were doing it in this sort of legal framework. and we were doing it according to our own laws, and therefore nobody should be surprised about this. And never mind, of course, that these laws, which I'm going to tell you about in a few seconds, first became laws only as the incarceration actually started, as we started incarcerating these Chinese Indians. So it was almost a sort of parallel phenomenon, the incarceration and the passing of the laws. So between October 1962, that date is important because, as you may know, our war with China went from middle of October 1962 to the middle of November 1962, just that 1 month. So from October 1962 till February 1963, which is a matter of 3 or 4 months, 5 months, we passed, first of all, something called the Defense of India Act. We amended something, the 1946 Foreigners Act, that's 2. Then we passed something called the Foreigners, I have to read this and be sure, the Foreigners Law, Application and Amendment Act. And then we also passed something called the Foreigners Restricted Area Act, Restricted Areas Order, I mean. And so these 4 laws that we put together in these 4 or 5 months were the legal framework. And as I've said a few times, and I say in the book, actually, I think of it as a legal fig leaf for the Deoli incarceration. That's the framework in which we started asking these questions about citizenship. All because we really found it convenient at that time. We found it desirable to start asking these questions of our fellow citizens. And it's important, I also feel, to talk about this today because whether in India or elsewhere in the world, and you can think of many examples, those same questions are getting asked again and again. In some sense, history is repeating itself. So every time, I want you to think about this, every time you hear outrage over immigration or prejudice against immigrants and so-called outsiders, every time you hear of attacks on people purely for the way they look, just to give you an example, there was this shooting in Atlanta just maybe a month ago where 7 or 8 Asian American women were killed. So every time you see incidents like that, you're up against questions like these, the same dilemmas that Chinese Indians faced in 1962. And that's one legacy of the Deoli incarceration, that's among many others, that it became respectable to ask these questions that to my mind at least should never have been asked. So if Joy's reasons for writing this book were to bring some awareness about this episode to people, which they sadly lack, mine were those two. That was part of my reason that I wrote that too. But I also wanted to ask these questions because I've been obsessed about this notion of citizenship and patriotism and nationalism and what all these things mean for many years. And again, I think these are questions that perhaps all of us should ask, or at least should think about. So I didn't want to say much more than that, but I did want to end by reading you the last 2.5 paragraphs of our book, or at least the text of the book. And let me just bring that up on my screen so I can read them out to you. So of course you could go to the book to read it, and I hope you will, but here's the last 2 paragraphs, just to give you an idea of what I'm talking about. But with the 1962 war, a feeling had spread across the land of a great betrayal by China, and that too after we had so often extended a hand of friendship. To the average Indian, it wasn't some faceless foreigners who were responsible. It was the slant-eyed people of our giant northeastern neighbor, easily recognized anywhere. Hatred for them came just as easily. Seamlessly, it made the leap to slant-eyed people who lived within our borders. Who would stop to ask why they, too, should be blamed for the betrayal? Who would question the suspicion directed at them? So to the average Indian, it seemed only natural that Indian authorities would take some official punitive action against this enemy within. And abusing them on that train, throwing stones at it, vandalizing their homes and businesses, all this was only natural too. In fact, it was even patriotic. No longer would we hide these thoughts. No longer were these thoughts wrong. So this is the legacy of 1962. in every hateful stereotype expressed about one or the other community today, every murderous attack on members of a different religion, every call to go to Pakistan, every unthinking use of words like chinky and kalia, you can trace roots that stretch back half a century to that prison camp. We don't realize it, but this is what Deoli has done to us. So that's all I wanted to say. Hari, thank you for giving me this chance.
Thank you very much, Dilip, for connecting the issue to the broader idea of citizenship, and also referring to how people who do not look like the so-called mainstream are like victimized. So now we move on to Kwai, who grew up in Calcutta and later immigrated to Canada. While working in accounting, Kwai returned to school, studied and graduated from the University of Toronto. And her MA thesis was on the survivors of the Deoli camp, for which Kwai interviewed Chinese Indians in the Toronto area. Over to you, Kwai.
Thank you, Harry. My experience is very much, as far as citizenship is concerned, very much the same as Joy Ma's. I was the youngest of nine siblings, 9 of us together. And I am the only one that was Indian citizen. And all my other siblings, they are actually stateless aliens. I think one of them now living in Nainital is still an alien, a stateless alien. But anyway, so my sister, who was a stateless alien, wants to visit her children in Sweden. So she couldn't get a passport in the British consulate. So she went to the Chinese embassy and got the Chinese passport. In order to leave India, a foreign nationals has to get a NORI, no objection to return to India, in order to come back. So there's my sister sail off into Sweden, and she overstayed. She stayed for 5 years. The NORI was expired, and the Indian embassy in Stockholm wouldn't issue her another one. So she had no choice but to go to China. She doesn't speak Mandarin and Putonghua. So she ended up there, has to learn that in a hurry because she only spoke Hakka and Hindi, of course. But anyway, so for citizenship, it's a very interesting issue. I was in school also with a girl, Gopal. Her father was Chinese, her mother was Nepalese. And during 1962, actually, her parents and 2 siblings were picked up to Deoli. What happened is it was Christmas. She went to a relative's house and stayed overnight. Next morning, she came home and the parents were gone. And so what happened? Who is she? Is she Chinese or Nepalese? So regardless, so she spent 2 years hanging around, drifting from one relative to another. I think the poor girl was totally traumatized because sometimes she had to practically sleep on the street or just, went on somebody's doorway and tried to spend the night. So citizenship and it's an interesting concept, but the other concept is, what's my identity? Am I Chinese or am I Indian? I did run into some students who was Indian, born in Canada, and I said that, oh yes, I am. I'm sort of Indian, and says, no way, speak Indian to me. I said, well, firstly, there ain't no such thing as Indian. So it was very interesting. But when I went to China, they look at me and somehow they just know I am not Chinese. So it's quite interesting. So I'm quite glad that I'm a Canadian, actually. But aside from the citizenship issue and the identity issue, also that not too many people know about, there are Chinese, ethnic Chinese in Calcutta, in India, period. So I would like to just quickly introduce Chinatown to those who doesn't know anything about the Calcutta Chinatown. When we Google Chinatown, Calcutta, what we show up is Tangra and Thapa. Those are the, in 1962 or 1950s, those were still basically swampland. About, it's 38 feet above sea level. They have to fill it up to build up in order to build their tannery. It's actually also very interesting that in Calcutta, there is distinction in the businesses that each group goes into. The Cantonese, there are two major groups, the Cantonese and the Hakka. The Cantonese goes to, mainly shoemaking and starting the tannery business in around the late 50s, 60s. The Cantonese were carpenters. So I don't think I ever know a Hakka who are carpenters or a Cantonese who are shoemakers. But Calcutta at that time, it's a very cosmopolitan place. I mean, while growing up, during Passover time, the Jewish Passover, there's this Jewish bakery that actually got more Chinese customer. And we would be buying unleavened bread, go to a Muslim restaurant, get curry. And if we are passing by, we feel like some chutney, we'll go to a Bengali grocer and get some green mango chutney. So we never really thought about identity. We know who we were. We were Hakka, we were Cantonese. So, and I have listened to my, Harry, do I still have time?
We have time.
So it is that most of the Chinese, actually, when you go to meet them in, say, Tim Hortons, you will hear them singing Hindi songs, reminiscing about their lives in Calcutta. And funny enough, most of them are before 1962, the life day off. And my older relatives, in the seniors' home, and you visit them, they will talk about the good times to have in Calcutta. There was this one relative who couldn't stop talking about the Chinese New Year celebration. the Chinese New Year parade, he will go into at length about the dragon dance, how they come down down the street. They go roll under and then rise up to bite the sky. And the pyramids, human pyramids, where the lion dancers climb up to get at the money from the third, fourth, or fifth story windows. But after that, it was the community changed. I know that Joy mentioned that her family was picked up by the police on Chinese New Year Day. So all this parade, but so on January 25th, 1963, the Chinese New Year, Year of the Rabbit, there was no parade, there was no celebration, and we were busy packing bags filled with, my mother thought we need rice. So I have rice in my bag, some money, and a change of clothes and shoes. And all the families, we all have a bag. For us, fortunate few, we didn't have to use it. But because of the 4 laws that passed, mentioned by Dilip, life was kind of quite difficult, even for those who were not in the camp. So all the Chinese family all decided to pull the children out of Chinese language school into English language. And so we all immigrated, all of us, well, most of us. Now in Terity Bazaar, that Chinatown, there was hardly any Chinese left. So the majority, the Chinatown was in Tangra. The tannery since then was closed. They moved to Bantala because of different issues, pollutions. Yes, it was bad. So now we have Chinese restaurant, but a lot of them are what we call astronaut, because they are staying in, say, in Canada or US or Australia, but still retain the factory in Tangra. So when I came to Canada, I couldn't go past the 1962. So I decided to use my MA thesis to interview the people or the detainees from Deoli. So the commonality is that they feel the loss of freedom. I mean, there was this one person told me that he likes to really, really want to go out and touch the bush with the yellow flowers outside the barbed wire fence. And I asked that, oh, is that do you have that plant inside? He said, oh yeah, it's very common.
Quite sorry to interrupt.
I'm up. Okay, I'll wrap it up.
Yeah.
So therefore, freedom is the most important part, that the commonality between everyone. Okay, thank you for listening.
Thank you, Kwail. Listening to you was as fascinating as reading your thesis. Now we turn our attention to Professor Sering Shakya, who is among the most prominent commentators on the Himalayan region and Sino-Indian relations. Professor Shakya is an associate professor at the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs and the Department of Asian Studies at UBC. He is the author of the book, The Dragon in the Land of Snow, A History of Tibet Since 1947. Professor Shakya, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Harry. Firstly, I thank Joy and Dilip and Kwai for sort of quite really moving account of their experience in India. And it's recounted not only a historical period, but whole question of belonging. Where does people belong? What attachment one has to a place. Although I'm not did not experience sort of internment or imprisonment, but the story of internment of the Chinese communities from Northeast India is sort of something which I known through my family, because I not read Kwai's MA thesis some time ago, but there was another book by Yin Marsh. I've been told Yin might be listening in the audience, who wrote another book about recounting the family's experience in Deoli in the internment. And a lot of the families who were interned were from Northeast India, particularly from Darjeeling, West Bengal, where there was a large number of Chinese communities. There was Darjeeling, Kalimpong, this area where my relatives live, and my wife's from Kalimpong. And we have a lot of sort of connections and family friends related to that. Another contact is while there were 3,000 Chinese who were detained in Deoli, there were another about 200 Tibetan families who were also at the camp at the time, and they were also suspected of being Chinese spies. And such is the stigma today. Even today, among the Tibetan families, they will not identify themselves as these people who were interned at settlement, because this fear of accusation and suspect of being Chinese spy is so strong and so still resonates with them that they really do not want to admit that they were in the prison at the period, even though it happened so many years ago, but people don't admit to that. And I'm sort of really glad, we're doing this seminar, and I think this is such a timely occasion to discuss this book and the question of citizenship. And in some degree, this timely reminder of what happens when government and public are swept by a wave of paranoid, fueled by nationalism and false narrative. The publication of the book and discussion now we're having is another timely reason is what we are witnessing: growing anti-Asian racism in North America. The pandemic has highly racialized and stigmatized worldwide based on the origin of the virus and its highly infectious nature. Profiling of Asians as suspect carrier of the virus and the resultant taunts and discrimination occurs worldwide. And India is not immune for such prejudice. Suppose Chinese, and there was some BJP politician who did launch the mass rallies saying go back Chinese virus and raising anti-Chinese rhetorics. And this time we don't have a sort of internment arrest of Chinese in India, but at the same time, the banning of Chinese apps. There's a campaign to stop buying Chinese good, banning Chinese good. And then there were actually a number of people who were been arrested as Chinese spies in last year in China. But I think profiling of Asian-looking, Dilip mentioned people who looked like, and that is one of the consequences of that internment happened, is that it's supposed to people who look like looking like Chinese has led to discriminate against people from Northeast India, people from Assam, Arunachal Pradesh, Mizoram, and Nagaland. This, I think, the racial slur that is prevalent in India called Chinky, Chowman, Chocho, Momo, this racial slur. And the last few years, there has been growing sort of awareness of this racial discrimination against people who look like Chinese. And I think that is really the result of association of ethnic Chinese as enemy within and enemy of China. And that is that kind of prejudice is really heightened by 1962 internment of ethnic Chinese in India. And I think we are holding this sort of online book launch in Vancouver, British Columbia. Again, this is sort of the sad association we have. In early 1942, the Canadian government detained and dispossessed more than 90% of the Japanese Canadian. Some 21,000 people living in British Columbia were detained under War Measures Act and were interned for the rest of the Second World War. And the government, confiscated their properties and business paid for their detention. They used the money that they confiscated from the Japanese Canadian for the internment and keep the prison. So it was only in 1988, the Canadian government formally apologized for the wrong it's committed against Japanese Canadian. And the symbolic gesture, Canada reappealed the War Measures Act, which legitimized the detention of the Japanese in Canada. But while Canada has reappealed this act, in Indian pretext in which the Chinese were arrested, it's called the Dilip mentioned this act, the Defense of India Act, passed hurriedly in the parliament in 1962. And this gave unprecedented power to detain individual and groups suspected of posing danger to India. It was under this act that ethnic Chinese from Northeast India were arrested, incarcerated in Deoli. So it's another sort of irony of that Deoli prison. It was established by British to intern the internationalist leaders during 1930s and 40s. And it was here in 1930s and 40s that the leaders of Satyagraha movement were interned there. So it's such ironic that New India will use its own people to intern in the same prison. That the current tension and worsening Sino-Indian relations have reenacted similar fear and engulfed India in the early 60s. Indian politicians mobilizing public opinions over security concerns about Chinese spies. Current situation also emerged from high hopes of rapprochement between President Xi Jinping and Prime Minister Modi, who had unprecedented 18 one-to-one meeting that no other leaders had such a number of meetings in a very short period of time between 2015 to 2020. Within 5 years, they had 18 one-to-one meetings. And there was such a high hope that with growing giants of Asia there will be rapprochement, high hope. Similarly, what we have saw in 1950s, the rhetoric, the second half was the Hindi-Chinese bye-bye. The India-Chinese are brothers. Relationship between the two countries were governed by Panchshila, the 5 principles of coexistence, whereby two countries agree to respect each other's sovereignty and territorial integrity and work towards peaceful coexistence. Agreement signed between Chong Lai and Nehru in 1954. Now, with such a high hope of Hindi-Chinese bye-bye, what happened? Why did 1962 background to the internment is the 1962 war between India and China. And there are two, particularly concerned from India, there are two narratives about Sino-Indian wars. Many ways, this is very similar to current discourse on China in India today. The first narrative popular in India that Indian leader Jawaharlal Nehru was credulous and naive about Chinese leaders and China's irredentist ambition. So that sort of blames partly on Nehru's own naivety in that. And this is today you find this accusation labeled against Nehru by BJP and populist media is very prevalent. You see that Nehru. The second sort of narrative is actually it's all Nehru's fault, not because of his weakness, because of Nehru was arrogant and refused to negotiate that. And that is sort of it first written by Neville Maxwell's India-China War, which and taken on by many what I call the Western leftists, sort of intellectuals who blame Nehru for adhering to colonial British colonial policies and not sort of realizing the shifting change that happened in Asia with the emergence of communist China. So this is the two sort of narratives which are popular in India. Both sides blame Nehru. There's one individual figure for this war. There is much more written about the Chinese sort of Indian side, partly because we have more access to Indian material, we have access to Indian archives and access to Indian media. So, but whereas we have less access to Chinese materials about what precipitated this war. And one of this, what I find is so perplexing is the two things missing in this narrative. In that, one is they fail to take account of local issues and what happened in Tibet in 1959. I have argued in my writing, had the Tibetan revolt of 1959, March 1959, and subsequent flight of the Dalai Lama to India, that there would have not been a border dispute or territorial dispute between India and China. So the main precipitating sort of factor has to be understood in what happened in Tibet in 1950s. That why did Chinese sort of agreement with the Dalai Lama's government failed, and why Tibet 1959 revolt happened. The 1959, another context in which we need to understand this issue is we need to look at it purely in the context of Cold War situation. How Chinese government, PRC government, saw this in Cold War context. Now, Cold War context, this is actually really interesting, pre-1960s, that is both the United States and Soviet Union. China, there is also not just in terms of context of the United States and Cold War, but I look at China and USSR. It is the beginning of the breakdown of Sino-Soviet relationship in that. And what is the Chinese perception that US is USSR, not the USA, but the USSR are aiding the Indian government. So you have two factors that which really created the war situation. Is that one is the revolt in Tibet. Secondly, the Cold War tension, the emerging Sino-Soviet split that happens. This Cold War tension, I think another thing we need to understand the anti-Chinese sentiment that propelled in and promoted in India. We need to look at this identification in the 1950s of ethnic Chinese, not just in India, from Burma to Indonesia, as sympathizers of communists, sort of covert communist agents, waiting to organize revolt in that. So you saw that wave of ethnic cleansing, anti-Chinese right from Burma to Malaysia to Indonesia, that happened. So that is ethnic Chinese were identified as sympathizers of communists, which is that really no basis to that, but this has perpetuated this threat, sort of perception Chinese threat to as enemy within and agents of communism. So that I think this this military, this perceived military threat, the justifying the detention of the Chinese, that really never existed in India. I mean, it only exists in the anxious sort of imagination of the officials, because we can see, not a single Chinese Indian were ever charged or for the wrongdoing or found to be guilty in the Indian court of law, But what has happened, you have this really irrational logic. You have, firstly, you deny them citizenship. You deny them citizenship, and they are nowhere to go. And then Lee mentioned, very interesting, that they are forced to take Chinese citizenship to travel or to move out of India. That in itself became the proof of their disloyalty. So you deny them citizenship, but then you're forced to take Chinese citizenship, and that was the proof they needed in sort of a public imagination in that. Sadly, many of these sort of issues that was raised about, who is citizenship is very current in India. This is not just now questions of ethnic Chinese. That's the much more bigger issues about Muslims and other communities in India being surfaced. People who've been dispossessed through legal means in a way. And some of the legacies that have slowly changing, but as the legislations, the Defense of India Act is still has not been reappealed, or in fact that has been strengthened in 1975. This was redrafted, and it made it much more draconian in that way. The protected areas area. Actually, in the past, most of Northeast India, like Assam, Arunachal Pradesh, Sikkim, even some parts of West Bengal, like Kalimpong, were until 1999, I would say maybe 2000, these were protected area. Also, when I was visiting my relatives, I couldn't go to Kalimpong where my wife from. We have to get a special permit. But today, I think it's only Sikkim is a protected area. You still need a permission to travel, foreigners to travel to Sikkim in that. So it still remains there. But Joy mentioned, how should India handle this issue now? Should there be sort of apology?
Professor Shakya?
Yeah.
We are
okay.
Short of time.
Okay, I'll stop there. And this, I'm just trying to give some historical and contextual to this really sad situation happened in India. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Shakya. You have touched on such multitude of topics that it would take some time to analyze all of them. So now we open the floor to questions. The audience is free to ask the questions on the Q&A, and we would ask the respective panelists to answer the questions. In the meantime, I would also like to ask some questions. My first question is to Joy. So, could you please tell a bit about your formative years? Even after the internment camp years, you spent a major part of your formative years in India. You went to school and you went to Lady Shri Ram College. So did the memories of the internment camp or the legacy of the internment camp shape your experience in India?
So, as a child, I was really protected. That's a great question. So as a child, I was really protected by my parents. They didn't want to burden us, it's very Asian, how want you to do your studies, but they did it for a reason. They didn't want that that sadness to touch me. And then when I was with the girls, so I studied in Calcutta till class 10, and I would I was just one of the girls. I was one of the 2 Chinese girls in my school, but at school everything's fine. The girls were not mean or anything. In fact, they were just my friends. But the difference is I never spoke about my background. They just knew me as Joy, who lives in wherever I lived, and then she had a mother who cooked nice food. They celebrate Chinese New Year. So that was all okay. I went to college again, made some wonderful, lovely friends that I'm still friends with, but never spoke about it um, because it really carries a stigma. Ying talks quite a bit about it, and the other people talk about it. You were treated like a prisoner, and so when you're a child, for them, I don't remember anything. I mostly deal with the legacy. For them, it was really a very bad experience. They were taken by people with guns drawn. In fact, my mother, when she was released and they were trying to find a place to put her, she was escorted by a bunch of policemen with their guns drawn. What is she, a woman, and three kids going to do, right? So that kind of thing, it wasn't a pleasant thing that I wanted to share with anybody, and I honestly didn't know how to talk about it.
Thank you, Joy. Uh, so we have a question for Dilip. So when I was doing some research on the topic, I found that in the last 15 years, there has been some kind of attention paid in the media. Like we have had those two documentaries and we have had your writings, books by Rita Chaudhary and Yin Marsh. But still but still in the broader discourse of the 1962 war, this event does not even receive a footnote. So, any particular reason for this ignorance, or is it just like a forgotten chapter and treated as such?
Well, of course, it's a forgotten chapter, Hari. I don't think that's any surprise, and I honestly don't think it's going to change very soon because, well, yes, there have been those films that you talk about, and there are these our book and Yin's book and Rita Chaudhary's book. Yes, possibly Rita Chaudhary's book is the most widely read of them because of all of these, because she actually wrote it first in Assamese. And so it was pretty widely read, and she's a very widely known figure in Assam. So, but there are still little drops in the ocean. There's a huge ocean of ignorance out there that I'd like to think that our book is causing some waves there, but the truth is really that it's just they're just really ripples. People don't read English that much. People don't read books that much. People don't pay attention to these issues that much. So that's the battle we're fighting, to try to fight this amnesia in different ways. And I'm not saying that this ignorance fills me with some pessimism, because otherwise I wouldn't have written the book. I don't think Joy would have. I think Joy would agree with me there. We hope to start making a difference in that. And the other point about that whole, the reason that it's not so well known is that, let's face it, this happened to 3,000 people, and it happened 60 years ago. So it's easy to forget that. And it's also something that if the country actually starts thinking about it, it's a matter of some shame, because why would we be proud of the fact that we incarcerated 3,000 of our own citizens for apparently no real reason that I can make sense of. So for those reasons, I think it is easy and convenient to forget. The people who might have remembered don't want to remember that this happened. So I'm not surprised at all that it's forgotten, and I honestly don't think that that's going to change substantially anytime soon. If there's some big figure in India who takes this up, let's say, off the top of my head, if let's say Amitabh Bachchan, one of our biggest film stars, said something about it, yes, well, then people will pay attention. If Sachin Tendulkar, who happens to be my neighbor, actually, the best known cricketer in India, he said something about it, yes. But if Dilip D'Souza and Joy Ma say things about it, there are 100 people on this broadcast and a few hundred elsewhere who will listen, and it doesn't get very far, but doesn't mean that we won't keep trying.
Thank you, Dilip. Like about 14, 15 years back, there was a prominent face from the Chinese Indian community, the singer Meiyang Chang, who came second in Indian Idol. He's actually prominently featured in the documentary From Border to Border. So he's one of the celebrities one of the faces of the community, and many others from the community have taken to singing because of him.
Yeah.
So yeah, he's
No,
one
I mean, it's
celebrity
true.
face.
In fact, Joy and I actually had a little dialogue with Mayang Chang. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. A few months ago, and we hope he was very receptive. I don't think we could work out some session where we could rope him in and he could talk about it. But maybe we will in the future. And it's true. There's another well-known badminton player, Jwala Gutta, who at the time that Corona started happening, she faced some discrimination. So we actually reached out to her and said, it's the same issue. What happened, and she has a Chinese mother, I think, if I'm not mistaken. So there are people like that who've spoken out, and there will be others. But again, they are drops in that big ocean, and let's hope that we find bigger and bigger drops.
So we have a question from an audience member. I think, Dilip, you can answer this question. How is this, or is it at all taught in Indian education system, for example, in history classes?
The quick answer is no, of course not. I mean, look at me. I grew up in this country, and I'm of that vintage where you think when I was in school, the war was only about 10 or 15 years old. You would think that it would have been taught. I mean, I certainly heard about the war, but no. I mean, it was when I was, how old was I? 2012. So I was over 50 when I first heard about this issue. And and not to blow my own trumpet, but I do think that I'm a somewhat aware Indian, that I know what's happening in my country, and it just blew my mind that I didn't know anything about this. It blew my mind that people had forgotten this entire incident. So it's certainly not taught in our history books. That is one thing I hope that we will have the wisdom as a country to start teaching in our history book, because history should not be just about our great successes and our glorious past, but about the mistakes we made and what have we learned from it. And I hope, by God, that we have learned something from this, and we should teach it to our children.
Thank you, Dilip. Joy, this question is for you. Given those of us who remember this history clearly and those who are not as familiar, what ways do you see the path to Indian citizenship for the current stateless Chinese in India?
That's a great question. I believe anyone who was born after 1955 has a path. And I would encourage those folks working to work with lawyers or people in the legal profession to make sure that you are able to take advantage of it. So I hope that's helpful, but I don't have any very concrete advice. But I feel for the people who are the elderly folk who are still stateless and and were born, I guess, before a certain time, if we or the people who have suffered this can help them get to that to achieve citizenship, or even waiving of some of the fees or the annual visits they have to take to go to Calcutta, that would be great. We were working on it, and then that got shelved, but perhaps that's something we can take up again.
Thank you, Joy. I would like to bring Kwai into the discussion here. Yeah, Kwai, you have an answer to the question.
I was saying, the brother that was refused to be, remain stateless, I think he was, all my siblings were born in India. He was asked, he could have got the Indian citizenship, but he, feels that since India didn't want him for so long, he doesn't want to be Indian after all. And he's living in India. So it is more his personal choice. But I believe that you were born in India. For the citizenship rule is that if you're born after February 1950, that was when the Constitution of India was drafted was actually put into law. So I think anybody after that date is automatically, or not automatically, you, as a Chinese, you still have to apply to be an Indian citizen.
I think it's not a very easy path, and that is a big barrier. It's a lot of paperwork, you know.
So, Professor Shakya, I think here I wanted to ask a question. Like, only around, I just found that only around 30 countries in the world have actually the concept of, even now, the concept of jus soli citizenship, that is birthright citizenship. And India is not exactly one of them. We don't become a citizen of India just because we are born, even now. We have to produce additional documents. So doesn't this look something like an anomaly in 21st century that only 30 countries actually follow birthright citizenship?
So in India, this sort of problem about citizenship, because it's due to the colonial legacy and history. In the earlier, the Citizenship Acts were sort of by descent. If you can prove you are descended from Indian family, whether you were in Pakistan or Bangladesh, you know, you can claim Indian citizenship through descent. Now, then they have to design to stop, say, Bangladeshis and Pakistanis, generally sort of designed to stop Muslims from claiming citizenship of India. They made citizenship by birth, but you have to be born in the time when Indian constitution was declared, 1950. So anyone who born after 1950 in India can claim Indian citizenship. But the problem is India doesn't have a very good documentation system. It's like many, I would say more than 60, 70% of the population don't have birth certificate. So, you know, how do you prove that you were born in India? I mean, you know, I know my relatives, many were born in India, but they never had a birth certificate. They never needed a birth certificate. But this is now the new requirement. You know, you have to additional document to prove your birth thing. And some of these, I mean, there are some can show school attendance, have signed by the DC. So there many, but it's a very difficult process. And many cases you have to go to court to get your citizenship. And to me, if individual has to go to court to get verify your citizenship, you know, it's might as well is not getting any citizenship. That's how difficult it is. That the onus of proving your citizenship is on the individual, not on the state. State doesn't have to prove you're not a citizen, but the individual has to prove he or her is a citizen of India. And it's very difficult when the country with tradition doesn't have a very good documentation system. You know, as I said, you know, how many, maybe more than 60, 70% would not have a birth certificate or marriage certificate for that matter.
Yeah, we actually are finding this gradually in the last 2-3 years when this whole CAA and NRC debate has started, and it has started gathering speed. So around 1.9 million people in Assam were rendered stateless because of the NRC's first phase. So we have a comment from someone in the audience, Shekhar. So he says he was in a school in Calcutta during the late 60s. We had Indian Chinese students, including children from the family of famous Waldorf restaurant. No one talked about this shameful incident, and none of us had any knowledge of it. There was no discrimination or slurring against these schoolmates. But because of, so his school actually had no such discrimination, but people were broadly muted when it came to the incident, when it comes to the incident. So Joy, when did this idea of speaking about this incident in a more open way come to your mind? Was it sometime in the early part of the 2000 decade?
Actually, it was during 2012 or 2011. So 2012 was the 50th anniversary, and I took a trip to India, and I met up with one of my friends, and my friend was writing a special report section for India Today magazine, and he just asked me, you know, he said, do you know of anyone who would write about this, or do you want to write about it? I don't even know how he guessed. And my first reaction was no, I didn't want to write anything about it. So I came home from India and I asked my mother and I said, do you want to say something, Mom? And she said, yes, I do. And so I just locked myself with her in a room and we wrote that first article, and that article was republished as a chapter in the book. And it was about what happened, and her journey to Deoli. So that was the beginning. And then Dilip and I talked about doing a book together. And then I realized also that it's really the story of a community and not just my family. And so that's when this book was born. And Dilip did all the wonderful research to help educate people, because for us, we live in the experience so much. And it's more about the human stories versus the background.
So, Dilip, I know you have mentioned this repeatedly, that they were rounded up just because they looked Chinese. But like a lot of, even the most educated people at that time may not have had many documents to prove their citizenship or prove that they were born here. So how do you think, was there any racial profiling involved when it came to rounding up citizens living in a particular area? How do you think the government narrowed down on the people who to incarcerate and who not to incarcerate?
Hari, I think you just answered that question anyway. I mean, it really boiled down to, I would like to think there was some other guidelines, but in the end, it boiled down to who looks Chinese and who doesn't. And there were, I think, one of Joy's interviewees, or maybe Yin, I'm forgetting, talks about how there was a guy from the community who's going down to the authorities telling them, this is the family you should pick up, that's the family you should pick up. And one of the crazy ironies of this whole situation is that man himself also ended up in the camp at some point later. So after pointing out people, he himself was also incarcerated. So there were those guys too who maybe just saw it as an opportunity to ingratiate themselves with the authorities. But what was it was so convenient that we were battling a country that whose people just looked so different from us. I mean, if we were in a as we have been, if we were in a war with Pakistan, how do you identify the people who might be Pakistani spies? I'm going to leave that question unanswered, but people may know what the answer is. But certainly it was not by the way they look, because Pakistanis look just like us. So, I mean, if the US and Canada ever went to war, God forbid, how would the US manage to identify Canadian Americans like they identify Japanese Americans? It's the same thing. It's going to be difficult because Canadians and Americans look just the same. So here was a situation where people just looked so different, and that's what led them to be incarcerated.
Thank you, Dilip. Yeah, Kwai.
Yeah, it is a very interesting case. There's a village in China, in southern China, where a group of Chinese Indian was sent there. This was the second or third generation. Chang Qing, who was a researcher, was in Calcutta for a while. She was there and she took quite a few photographs, and they look Indian. They wear saris for certain date where, the pujas. I think Durga Puja, is one of them. And also, the grandparents were the one that got deported. Now the kids looks Indian. They didn't have a picture of the grandparents. Now, how would then, to distinguish that Indian-looking Chinese should be deported? I think it's a very complicated issue. And by the way, they also speak Hindi. They try to learn Hindi in a village in China and wore sari for festivals. So I don't know. The question is actually, it's very interesting. Or is it that they just look at that and say, I don't like the look of your face, so therefore you are going? And these were people actually deported back to China. And they were born in India. They were, one of the parents was Indian. It's puzzling.
There is a question of citizenship and there is a question of identity, as you pointed out earlier, and
Yeah.
And often it becomes a question of crisis in both areas. So, Professor Shakya, we are kind of running short of time. One question, Professor Shakya, I wanted to ask: why do you think Tibetans were rounded up at that time? Because only in 1959, Dalai Lama and all those Tibetans were given asylum. But what made the government suspect them of being Chinese spies?
Oh, this it's a very long history. There within this is some extent it is internal Tibetan politics also. There are rivalries for power and politics within the Tibetan diaspora community. Those who are thought to be sort of anti-Dalai Lama were suspected of being Chinese communists, or they are also Tibet. This is goes actually. If you look at the history of settlement of Chinese in Northeast, we have to go back to the collapse of Qing dynasty. The Qing soldiers who were stationed in Tibet was expelled in 1911. And many of them returned to China, but some of the Qing soldiers were married to Tibetan women. So many of them settled in Darjeeling, Kalimpong, Shillong areas. So they were mixed Indian, Chinese and Tibetans from that descent. So you have that sort of complication of sort of ethnicity in that way. So because of their Chinese sort of ancestry, they are also suspected of being Chinese, sympathetic to China. And that's one reason. But the other one is about the politics. Those who were sort of critical of the diaspora elite were often accused of being. And there were Tibetans who also, Philip talks about those who look like. So if you look at the Tibetans also who were detained were mainly from Amdo, from present-day province of Qinghai. So they look more Chinese or Han than Tibetans from Western region. So this it's a fear of people who look like something else, not us. That's the element.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor Shakya. I think this question, we have two more questions and then we'll maybe wind up. One question is by Ali. I think this is for Dilip and Joy. Was this idea of setting up an internment camp inspired by the precedent set by Canada and US with Japanese, Canadians, or Americans? And what kind of documents were you able to access in the archives?
Philip, you want to take that one?
Well, as we've touched on already today, certainly what happened to Japanese Americans and Japanese Canadians in World War II was a precedent. If you're asking, did it inspire what happened in 1962 in India? I mean, I'm sure our Indian authorities had that in mind at the time, that this is a step, the kind of step that we can take, and that it happened before. These other countries did it, so we can too. I don't know if there was any official documentation that showed that connection, but I'm sure it was in people's mind because it was only 20 years old at the time. As for documents, I think the question was whether did we find any documentation about this? Is that what the question is?
Yeah, that was the question, Dilip. Were you able to access material from the archives that that mentioned the event?
No, I mean, I accessed materials from our archives in different forms, but I don't think I ran across anything that spoke specifically of the Japanese-American internment. So I'm just, like I said, I'm just guessing that was an inspiration. I mean, it had to be. It had to be because it was such a big event. It was so widely known, and it was still young in people's memories. It was only 20 years old at the time.
And I just had, I mean, there is a tradition, sort of history of internment in India during the British colonial period. And of course, during the Second World War, German missionaries, German scholars, and Italians, they were all interned in Dehradun, another camp, and Chakrata. There. So you had the really very famous German Indologists, Sanskritists, scholars, missionaries, and similar Italians were interned there. And of course, you had the story of Henry Harrer, who escaped from one of the internment camps.
So, Professor Shakya, you're right. And in fact, the Deoli camp was also used for prisoners of war during World War II and earlier. But the difference is really that most of these people you mentioned were actually, as far as I can tell, were actually people who the British government saw. I mean, they were not citizens of India. They were they'd come to India to work, or there were scholars, like you said. Right. Whereas the Chinese Indians, like the Japanese Americans, were in very much part of Indian society. Yes. They were in the tea plantations and all that. I mean, that story is widely known. So that's the difference.
True, yeah. Yeah.
So we have one last question, and it's a slightly broad one. Facing the shifting geopolitics and conflicts, what choices and strategies do those stateless individuals have? I presume that the speaker is talking about stateless individuals still in China, stateless individuals who are of Chinese origin who are still in India. So, what strategies do they have?
Joy, you get that.
Oh, okay. Gosh. Sad to say the climate for inclusion and diversity is sort of waning, I feel, in all countries. There are some movements to sort of ramp that up, but I just I really don't have an answer because there isn't a good one, because we've already talked about how difficult it is for stateless individuals to get a path to citizenship. Professor Shakya talked about it, and then we also there's no documentation, and the path is very difficult. I think at a very high level, and not to turn the whole conversation back to the book, but one of the most powerful things we can do as individuals is to raise public opinion. And when we learn about our history, that's how we can inform what's happening in the future. So if what happened to the internees of 1962 becomes something that everybody knows about, perhaps we can move even governments and states to have a better strategy for helping people find citizenship, especially if they've lived there for generations and they are not living anywhere else. So I don't know if it's very typical, but that's what I think.
Thank you everyone for speaking, and I think we are about to next year, in 2022, we'll have 60 years of the war, and I think this is one event I hope that will be covered more widely when that anniversary comes. Unlike in 2012, when we had just one small chapter in one big issue. So on that note, I think we'll conclude the event. Thank you very much to all the speakers, Dilip, Joy, Professor Kwai, and Professor Shakya. We had a fascinating discussion on the, and I'm pretty sure there will be a lot of scholarly attention on the issue. And I think it's time for us to wind up. And in case anyone from our audience has more questions on the issue, would the panelists be open to answering them through mail?
Certainly.
Yeah.
So yeah, on that note, I think we'll wind up. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. And on behalf of SPPG and CISAR, I wish you a very good evening, good morning, and wish you a great day. Bye.